We're in the midst of a chronic illness epidemic. Sicknesses like cancer, heart disease and diabetes are sweeping the world. There's a 1 in 2 chance you'll end up with a chronic illness. It's likely you know someone or you are someone who is sick. Diseases our grandparents have never heard of are becoming common. Mental illness, autoimmune disease, metabolic syndrome. These are modern sicknesses. They're not infectious, but they are spreading fast.
I think we've been seeing a stress epidemic in our society for decades now, and it seems to be only accelerating as the pace of modern life is increasing.
It was always obvious to the ancient wisdom traditions that mind and body were interconnected, but somewhere along the line we sort of created a dichotomy as if they were separate.
We came to believe that everything could be cured by drugs and surgeries, whereas to this day they can't.
When we talk about much of mind-body phenomena, we're talking about the non-physical mind affecting the physical body. That's not allowed for in the Western scientific paradigm.
And we now understand these concepts that were rejected by academic medicine.
So this is something that actually has enormous implications.
Modern science has shown us that the mind has the power to heal. We should use that capacity.
I was 24 when I got my first break in journalism. My life became focused on deadlines and chasing stories that took me away from my family and friends. Then, everything changed. I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. One doctor warned I could end up in a wheelchair or with organ failure. Over the next 6 years, I spent $30,000 on numerous specialist doctors, constant tests, drugs and alternative therapies. I was flat with fatigue and riddled with arthritis. No one could tell me why my immune system was attacking my own body. But there was one thing I did know. The more I was stressed, the worse I felt. I knew there had to be a connection. On my journey to getting better, I travelled the world to find answers, meeting some of the leading experts at the frontier of science and tracking down people with remarkable stories of recovery. This is the film I wanted to see when I got sick.
In the older days, there was no separation of mind and body. In fact, throughout the world, many cultures have never separated them, in the East, for example. But our scientific approaches were so awesome that they overwhelmed any mind-body approaches or any mind-body potentials.
In Western science, unless you see it, it isn't real. Unless you can measure it, it isn't real. And that's what allowed the huge advances in modern medicine and science, the ability to do these amazing things that we can do with cures today. And we now understand these concepts that were rejected by academic medicine because we didn't understand them. We understand them now in the language of science. And now where we're at is we can take these principles and apply them to clinical care, to the next phase, the next new frontier, which is integrative medicine.
The body is always responding to whatever the mind tells it to do. So when the mind's tense, the body's tense. When the mind's happy, the body's happy. So the body is always responding, not just in ways in terms of our physical tensions, like the tensions of the muscles, but even right down to the very core of our cells, even what's happening in the level of our DNA.
And what's really been interesting in the last 5-10 years is really understanding that it really is a lot of two-way connections. And there's a lot of molecules that we always thought of sort of, just in the body, and we're recognizing that they actually also play roles in the brain, and that the brain can also influence the body at even a very cellular level.
All of these terms, I think, are approaching the same idea that the mind is not separate from the body. In fact, my belief is that the only way you can really separate mind and body is verbally, that they're two aspects of the same underlying reality, or two poles of the same thing.
Here's what we know about the mind-body connection. You may be familiar with the idea that your brain is like a central message center, sending and receiving electrical and chemical signals all over your body. And now scientists are starting to understand that the communication between your brain and body is far more significant than they once realized. For example, over 60 neurotransmitter and hormonal receptors have been found on the surface of immune cells designed for fighting disease. Your brain has a direct connection to your body's first line of defense, and those cells can talk back. In another major breakthrough, scientists have discovered around 80 million neurons in your gut. They're calling it the second brain because while it talks to the brain, it can also act completely independently and influence behaviour. So rather than there being a mind in your head, it's more like your mind is all through your body. But the easiest way to understand how your mind affects your health is by looking at stress. One way scientists teach people to evoke the relaxation response is to train people to meditate by focusing their attention on just one thing. With practice, they become inwardly aware and focused on the present moment. And now, with the development of modern brain imaging technology, researchers are starting to understand the biological mechanisms underpinning the practice. While to an outsider, it looks like a person meditating isn't doing much, it turns out there's a lot happening in their brain.
The really wonderful thing about MRI is that it lets us look at the human brain in a way that we couldn't before. Most of the work that we've done centers on how meditation can change the actual structure of the brain. Some of the research shows that part of the brain called the amygdala gets turned down. And the amygdala is important for the fight or flight response. So when you see something scary, so for instance, if you're walking in the woods and you suddenly see a snake out of the corner of your eye, your amygdala is gonna alert you and say, oh, and make you jump. And that part of the brain seems to get quieter as you meditate. And so this is consistent with a sense of decreased arousal and greater feelings of peace.
Brain imaging technology is relatively new in the context of scientific discovery, and it's early days for mind-body research. But Dr. Sarah Lazar's Harvard study on meditating people has interesting parallels with studies recently done on mice at the National Centre for Biological Sciences. Researchers took normal mice and stressed them out for 2 hours a day. When they measured their brains, they found the amygdala got bigger. After 10 days, they left the mice alone, but 2 weeks later, they observed they were still acting anxiously. They measured their brains again, and although their stressors had been removed, they found the mice amygdala was still large.
This is the opposite of what we're seeing with people who meditate. Their life is exactly the same as it's always been. So they still have their stressful job. All the difficult people in life are still being difficult, but their amygdala has gotten smaller and they're reporting less stress. So it shows in both cases that it's not so much the environment, but your reaction to the environment and how you're relating to the events and the people in your life. And so it's not about changing your life, it's about changing your relationship to your life.
The work that I do revolves around a clinic that I started 34 years ago now called the Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction Clinic, or MBSR. I was having lunch with a bunch of dermatologists, and they were talking about some of their patients giving up on their treatments in the dermatology clinic, particularly patients with the skin disease psoriasis. And the treatment for it was a course of ultraviolet light therapy. We did a small randomized trial that compared people just getting the light treatment with people meditating while they were getting the light treatment. And it turned out the meditators' skin cleared at about 4 times the rate of the non-meditators. And I didn't believe it. It was such a powerful finding. So we replicated it and tried to make a little bit more rigorous study design. And lo and behold, again, the meditators were healing 4 times as fast as the non-meditators. And it is a beautiful example of the mind-body connection because you're doing something with your mind and something is happening in the skin. So it just doesn't get any better than that.
If you look at the data that I've collected in my career on the impact of the mind-body program on fertility rates in infertility patients, and the fact the program costs a few $100s and pretty much doubles pregnancy rates. Yes, if you had a pill that did that, every infertility patient in the country would take it.
I learned about Ali Domar's mind-body program for infertility, and it sounded like exactly what I needed. Just going to the first meeting and seeing all these women in the room that, looked like they were normal, and just looking around the room and saying, like, I'm not alone, I'm not a freak, I'm just, another woman that has a struggle like the rest of them. And that was just extremely powerful in terms of just turning my mood around and helping me to feel more optimistic about my life, regardless of whether I got pregnant or not. After a period of, using the mind-body techniques that I had learned, I felt that I would proceed to the IVF treatment. We ended up getting just 1 embryo, and that embryo took on the first try, and I did conceive. I got pregnant, and ultimately delivered my first child, my baby boy Luke, who's now almost 2 years old.
Most of my research is actually looking at the impact of the mind-body program on infertility patients. And we found the women who did the mind-body program, in addition to having much fewer physical and psychological symptoms, had a 55% take-home baby rate compared to a 20% take-home baby rate in the control group. So 55%, 20%. The research shows that if a woman feels stressed, she continues to meet the demands of her family, her home, and her job, and she lets go of her friends, which is the thing you need the most when you're stressed. And I think it's an expression that a crisis shared is half the burden. And so I think that's why social support's so important.
I just think it's fascinating to be thinking you're sitting in a chair practicing a mind-body technique like meditation, and you're doing genetic engineering at the same time. I find that extraordinary. So how we feel and how we relate to ourselves and the world has an effect on our aging through a whole lot of different mechanisms, from genetics to physiology, for better or for worse. And things accelerate aging, and there are things that slow it down. And it's not surprising. Having good emotional health, coping well with demands of day-to-day life, leading a healthy lifestyle slow it down. And the things that we associate with poor mental health and an unhealthy lifestyle speed it up. Just depends on how fast we want to burn the wick. But if there was a patentable product that had those kinds of effects, we'd be all over it. We'd be spending billions of dollars on research and rolling it out in no time at all.
It's been nearly 10 years since I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. A 3-year journey to make this film. I am not in a wheelchair. I am not on medication. I now see that when it comes to my health, balancing my mind and body is as essential as the air I breathe. And in a strange way, I'm grateful for the illness, Because like so many other people I've met along the way, it wasn't until I got sick that I realised I needed to get better.